What people feel when you decide to walk away, Carl Jung, your silence broke them. Have you ever wondered what really happens when you walk away without a word? Not out of anger, not to punish, just quietly, completely. You leave the room, the dynamic, the story, and suddenly everything starts to shift. This isn't just absence, it's disruption. Because when someone walks away in silence, they don't just exit a conversation, they break the emotional structure it was built on. Carl Jung believed that silence doesn't destroy, it reflects. And when the mirror disappears, people are left face to face with parts of themselves they could once ignore. In this video, we explore what your silence actually triggers: confusion, projection collapse, emotional scrambling. Not because you wanted to hurt them, but because your absence touched something deeper than words ever could. If you've ever chosen silence over explanation, this is your story too. Sometimes, not saying a word is the loudest truth. Let's begin. Walking away isn't a simple act. It's a deep psychological shift. And what makes it so powerful is not what you do, but the silence that comes with it. That silence is the loudest echo. It is not an ending. It is the beginning of a process they never asked for, a psychological reconfiguration that begins with anxiety, confusion, and denial. That's why when you leave in silence, they don't just feel your absence, they feel their own identity begin to waver. And that sometimes is the very first sign of awakening. Your absence, a mirror of rejected truths. As long as you're present in someone's life, they can deny a great many things. They can pretend the relationship is fine, that they're fine, that everything is still functioning as it should. But when you leave, and silence begins to envelop everything, something shifts. What's terrifying isn't your absence, but what it reflects. People have a strange ability. They can live in denial for a long time, as long as someone helps them maintain the illusion. And you, unintentionally, may have carried that burden. You became the mirror they used to reflect the image of themselves they wanted to see. They could deny emotional dependency, selfishness, lack of understanding because you were still there, filling the void, carrying the unnamed emotions. But when you're gone, that mirror shatters. There's no one left to blame, no one left to control, no one left to support the roles they played so skillfully in their inner lives. And the most terrifying thing happens. They have to look at themselves with no mask to hide behind. That's when the truth emerges, not about you, but about them, the emotions they denied, the flaws they ignored. Your absence is not just an empty space. It's a vortex that forces them to face aspects of their identity they had never touched. The things you patiently accepted are no longer tolerated. The things you tried to build now have no one to uphold them. And in that void, everything begins to feel exposed. They may never say it, but deep down, they feel like they're falling into a silent space where no one is watching, where no one is supporting them. There's no one to help mask old wounds, no one to maintain the illusion of being needed. And so, for the first time, they have to ask, without you, who am I? A question they never had the courage to face before. What surfaces now is not pain from loving you too much. It's the psychological disruption caused by you filling a vital gap they never knew how to address. And as you step away, that gap becomes a mirror with no image left, only truth, raw and unrelenting. They begin to miss you not because you were the most special person in the world, but because you helped them avoid facing themselves. Now, your absence becomes your most powerful presence. And in that presence, they finally see what they had hidden most, that they were never strong enough to stand on their own. You didn't have to do anything, your departure did it all. And sometimes that has more power than any words could ever carry. It's not that you disappeared, it's that the light you once brought now leaves their darkness with nowhere left to hide. When you were carrying the emotions they couldn't handle in many relationships, there's a paradox few dare to acknowledge. You weren't just a friend, a partner, or a loved one. You became the emotional container, not because you were especially resilient, but because they hadn't yet learned how to face their own emotions. Have you ever felt like you became the outlet for their unexplained anger, their heavy silences, their unmet emotional demands? When you were there, you served as a buffer for all the feelings they hadn't yet processed. You weren't just a presence, you were an emotional exhaust valve for pressures they couldn't handle internally. The pain they carried wasn't acknowledged, it was transferred onto you, without apology. Now, they're not simply sad about losing you, they're afraid because they must face themselves. They're angry because there's no one left to carry the burden of unnamed pain. But this too is an opportunity. Only when you're no longer the emotional surrogate can they begin to learn how to take responsibility for their inner world. And perhaps you felt guilty, thinking you abandoned them in their chaos. But the truth is, you cannot carry someone else's emotional weight forever. Everyone must learn to stand on their own. Your walking away wasn't abandonment, it was an invitation for them to return to themselves. You were never meant to be their healer. You were simply someone who once stood in the storm and then chose to walk out, giving them the chance to learn how to weather it on their own. And in that process, both of you grow, though, in very different ways. But growth rarely comes in peace. It arrives through quiet collisions, unspoken struggles, and a kind of awakening that cannot be denied. Abandoned emotions. When anger masks powerlessness. When you withdraw, the first thing they feel is not longing, it's anger. A sudden, vague, yet very real surge of anger. It might appear through cold silence, sarcastic remarks, or even indirect acts of aggression. But if you look closer, you'll see that anger is not the root emotion. It's just a cover. What's truly present beneath it is helplessness. They can't call you back. They can't keep you with apologies or the tactics they once used. Those invisible traps, like expectations, obligations, familiar roles, no longer work. And that makes them feel like they're losing control over their emotions and their sense of stability. Anger becomes the most primal way to deal with the loss they haven't yet named. They're angry because you chose silence. They're angry because you stopped doing what they had come to expect of you, enduring. They're angry because you no longer fulfill the silent role they once imposed on you, the listener, the soother, the emotional scapegoat they couldn't manage on their own. Anger is a defense mechanism. It's a wall built to avoid facing the truth, that they are more fragile than they imagined. Your retreat has inadvertently exposed that truth far too clearly. And at that moment, they begin to feel a very different kind of emptiness, the void within their perception of you. When you were present, they could project any image onto you, good or bad, as long as it helped maintain their inner balance. But when you disappear, those images collapse. What remains is a flood of unanswered questions. Who were you really? Why did you leave? What were you feeling that they never saw? That anger slowly morphs into doubt, and if that doubt isn't examined, it can turn into prolonged emotional damage, not because of what you did, but because they don't know what to do with their own feelings in your absence. You're no longer there to absorb their rage, to carry their expectations, to fill their emotional void. They start to feel adrift, but instead of looking inward, many respond with the opposite. They reconstruct a new version of you in their mind, the selfish one, the cold one, the heartless one, just to avoid confronting the truth that they're empty not because you left, but because they never learned how to stand on their own. This is where self-awareness can be triggered, or completely buried for those with courage. They may begin asking, who am I without them? And from there, a new journey can begin, one that's rooted in self-discovery, no longer dependent on how others see them. But for those unready, they'll try to suppress the disorder with anger, denial, blame, or by replacing you with someone else, just to avoid facing their own loss of control. And the heartbreaking part in that chaos, many will choose to remember you not through truth, but through the story they need to tell themselves to protect their ego. They'll revise memories, color them with distortion, replace truth with assumption. They'll tell others a different version of you, not to hurt you, but to stop themselves from falling apart. But you no longer control that, and you no longer need to, because your departure already fulfilled its deeper purpose. It awakened a mind that only seemed stable, but was built on a borrowed version of self. That disruption may be painful, but it may also be the first step, for them, perhaps for the first time, to begin the journey of finding their true self. And you, even in absence, remain the one who opened the door to a path they never dared to walk before. Left alone with themselves, the deepest fear we all carry your absence isn't just a gap in their life. It's an unwelcome invitation to return to themselves. And right there, their most primal fear arises, being alone with their own mind, no one to reflect off of, no one to blame, no one to cling to. They're forced to face the raw contents of their inner world without anyone else's filters. Imagine a room that once bustled with noise, energy, connection. One day, it falls silent. The only one left is them, with memories, thoughts, and internal voices they've always avoided by talking to you, relying on you, or using your presence to drown it all out. Now, there's no one to distract them. Every sound they hear comes from within. And that is the loneliest place of all, not because someone is missing, but because the self that's left behind has never been truly known. When you were there, you were like a psychic shield protecting them from their own darkness. But your withdrawal strips that away, leaving them with the raw question, who am I when no one is here to tell me? This is where the ego begins to fracture. They once believed they were strong, independent, in control. But your leaving reveals the truth. They needed someone else just to stay psychologically afloat. Now, with no one to carry the feelings they can't process, all those emotions rise, messy, overwhelming, fear of abandonment, feelings of worthlessness, unhealed wounds. In that moment, they're no longer angry at you for leaving, they're angry at themselves, for depending so deeply they lost all sense of direction without someone. But instead of admitting that, they often mask it with external anger, blame, or self-defense. Yet, in this moment, if they're brave enough, a real journey can begin, the journey of self-understanding, self-acceptance, and learning how to be alone without being lonely. You may never know it, but your departure, even if it caused them pain, might be their first real call to awaken. We can't control what someone learns from the pain we inadvertently cause, but we can hope that our absence isn't just a void, but a quiet space where someone finally begins to listen to themselves. No more noise, no more borrowed identities, only the truth. And sometimes, that truth is exactly what they need to finally become whole. In their mind, you didn't just leave, you betrayed the symbol they had assigned to you. And this is what makes the pain far more complex. They're not only grieving your absence, they're grieving the collapse of a self-protective psychological structure. In psychology, this is called the collapse of the attachment symbol, when a person loses the internal image they use to cope with their inner insecurity. What hurts them isn't necessarily that you stopped loving, it's that you stopped playing the role they needed you to play. You were no longer the main character in the narrative they'd built to avoid facing their own truth. And when that truth is suddenly laid bare by your withdrawal, they spiral into confusion, disorientation, and a quiet identity crisis. You may not have realized it, but your presence gave them a sense of emotional navigation, a kind of inner compass in a chaotic world. When you walked away, you took with you the emotional map they used to regulate themselves. Now, there's no shield, and a flood of emotions overwhelms them, driving them into panic, often resulting in toxic reactions, blame, resentment, even hatred. But precisely at that point of collapse, if they are brave enough to look inward, something new can be born. The truth is you didn't break them. They had built you up as an unsustainable crutch. And if they have the courage, they'll realize the only true anchor is within themselves. You don't need to come back to fix those cracks. Sometimes your departure is the very opportunity they need to finally do the one thing they've never dared to do, rebuild trust, not in someone else, but in themselves. And though that process may begin in anger, if transformed, it can lead to real emotional maturity. No one wants to be the one who caused someone else's collapse. But you didn't choose that, you simply chose to live honestly, and to stop being a shadow figure in someone else's inner world. And sometimes, that's the bitter medicine someone needs to finally begin to heal from the inside out. Emotional conflict. When reason tries to understand what instinct refuses, when someone walks away from your life, the rational mind speaks first. Maybe they need space. Perhaps they've changed. I should respect their choice. But beneath that calm exterior is a strong undercurrent, a primal instinct refusing to accept reality. And suddenly, you're swept into an internal civil war, emotion and reason clashing, neither fully winning. The mind understands they had the right to leave, but instinct can't accept it. It screams, "This isn't fair, you didn't deserve this." And so you move through tangled layers of emotion, sadness, anger, doubt, despair, longing, resentment, sometimes all at once. This isn't weakness. It's the intricate truth of being human. In psychology, this is known as cognitive dissonance, when what you know contradicts what you feel. And when the person who left was deeply embedded in your emotional structure, their absence isn't just a void, it's a rupture in your emotional regulation system. You don't know where to put your feelings, so you try to analyze them, to control them, but you can't. You begin to ask yourself, what did I do wrong? Why didn't they say anything before they left? If I change, will they come back? These aren't just questions. They're desperate attempts to restore emotional order. The mind wants to solve the problem, while instinct just wants to feel safe again. Then comes the hardest truth. Emotions don't follow logic. People may leave not because they hate you, not because you failed, but simply because their path took a turn. Yet the mind tries to interpret it as betrayal, as a mistake, as something to fix. You revisit every moment, every word, searching for a logical explanation, but not everything has a clear answer. And this is where you stand at a psychological crossroads. Keep digging for a rational explanation, or begin to accept that you don't need to understand everything to find peace. In healing, this is the most critical point. You don't need to decode everything to be okay. You only need to admit that some things are beyond logic, and your emotions don't need permission to exist. When you allow yourself to feel without judgment, something remarkable happens. You begin to soften. Not because you figured them out, but because you're finally beginning to understand yourself. And that's what they'll never see, the silent battle between logic and instinct, the war between wanting to understand and needing to feel. All they saw was your silence. But inside, you were weathering a storm, and from that storm, if you don't run, you'll find a new strength. Not from the answer, but from acceptance. Because once reason stops forcing understanding, instinct stops resisting, and in that moment you'll realize their leaving isn't a puzzle to solve, it's a door to a new chapter of healing within yourself. You and their memory, no longer you, but the version they needed to imagine. When you quietly exit someone's life, without blame, without drama, you leave behind a space. But humans can't tolerate emptiness for long. They begin to fill it, not with truth, but with memory. Not with the real you, but with a version of you they need in order to survive your absence. You were once part of their emotional infrastructure, someone they could vent to, seek comfort from, an invisible pillar when their world shook. When you left, that structure collapsed, but instead of rebuilding it from scratch, many choose to construct a version of you, an image that requires no consent, no presence, no truth. And so they begin to imagine they miss you, but not the real you. They recall your silence and label it cold. They remember your boundaries and call them heartless. They take your smile and assign it a shade of indifference, every detail rearranged, edited, reconstructed like a film rewritten after the lead actor exits the set. Here's the painful truth. Once you've stepped away, you no longer control your image in their mind. They may idealize you as someone good but too complicated, or paint you as selfish to justify the hurt inside them. Either way, you're no longer yourself, but a mirror reflecting what they need to face. Because people don't hate you for who you are, they resent you for making them confront what they can't accept in themselves. Dependency, expectations, unhealed wounds. And to escape that discomfort, they distort your image for self-protection. In psychology, this is the mechanism of idealization, followed by devaluation. When someone important disappears, the mind scrambles to assign a meaning that is emotionally digestible. The easiest story is, you weren't worth it. You were the problem, you changed. Few have the courage to say, they were right to leave. And I never saw it. And so you don't need to correct anything. You don't need to go back and explain, I'm not who you think I am. Because the person they remember isn't you. They're living with a memory they've curated, while you, if you're fortunate, are living with the truth. And that's the greatest paradox. You were once fully present, but only in your absence did they start to see you through a distorted lens. Not because you changed, but because they never really understood who you were. In emotional maturity, this is a vital lesson. You can't control how you exist in someone's memory, You can only control your honesty with yourself. And when you walk away with that integrity, whether they remember you as an angel or a villain, you retain what matters most, your freedom. Freedom isn't being loved correctly, it's having the strength to leave when you are no longer seen truthfully. And if living as the villain in someone's story is the cost of your peace, then that, too, is a worthy choice. You used to be part of their emotional routine, a familiar phone call, a person to vent to, a point of stability during moments of disorientation. Though unspoken, you played the role of a piece in the puzzle of how they made sense of themselves. They knew how to behave, how to react so long as you were still there. But when you vanished from the equation, something strange happened. They began to lose the ability to define what you were to them, or worse, who they were without you. You're no longer the confidant, but also not distant enough to be forgotten. You're not someone they can blame, but not close enough to be forgiven. You reside in a nameless in-between, and that terrifies them. They once thought they held the power, the choice to keep or discard a relationship. But when you chose to step away quietly, without drama, they came to a bitter realization they no longer had control over you. Psychology calls this emotional role confusion. When someone steps out of a role that another person unconsciously assigned them, the entire psychological stage collapses, with no one left to absorb blame, validate worth, or be emotionally manipulated. The one left behind loses control, and that panic often gets disguised as anger, indifference, or narratives that protect the ego. Because people don't just fear losing others, they fear losing the roles those people help them maintain. A person who once soothed their rage, made them feel needed, or stood between them and their loneliness. When you step away, they are forced to stand alone, no one to lean on, no one to blame. And then something even more dramatic unfolds. You become something they can't categorize. You're no longer an ex, not an enemy, and not quite a friend. You're a very specific void, and that contradiction shakes them to their core. Some people choose denial. They act like you were never important, but those are often the ones most out of control, desperately trying to convince themselves that your absence hasn't changed anything, while inside, everything is unraveling. Others fall into idealization. They begin to see you as near perfect, not because you were, but because elevating you allows them to avoid responsibility for their own emotions. By turning you into a symbol, they can avoid confronting the truth. But whether it's denial or idolization, both responses stem from the same reality. They've lost the ability to define your role in their life. And though no one says it out loud, that hits their once confident ego harder than anything else. When you walked away in silence, you didn't just create a void in their life, you created a void in their perception of themselves. And when they can no longer name you with a familiar label, they can no longer name themselves the same way either. And that's when control, once only an illusion, finally collapses. Sometimes, the pain is what they needed to grow. We often see pain as something to avoid at all costs. Avoid sadness, avoid loss, avoid heartbreak. But there's a deeper truth that few dare to confront. Sometimes, pain is the only thing strong enough to trigger real growth. When you left not with accusations, not with drama, you left behind a space, a silence wide enough to force them to face themselves. No one left to cling to, no one left to blame, no one left to lean on, only them, and all the truths they never dared to acknowledge. At first, they may label the void with familiar terms: betrayal, cruelty, indifference. But gradually, as the rage softens, what remains is a lingering ache, and if they're brave enough, that ache opens a door. Because you weren't just someone who walked away, you interrupted a long-standing pattern of self-defense. You forced them to ask new questions. Why does this loss feel so destabilizing? What was I expecting from this relationship? And deeper still, why was my sense of worth so dependent on another person? Carl Jung once said, "There is no transformation of consciousness without pain. No one evolves in comfort. No one stares in the mirror if the world outside remains unchanged." But when you left, you caused their internal world to collapse. And in those shattered pieces, they might find something more honest. It could be the start of taking responsibility for their own emotions. With no one left to coddle their insecurities or excuse their reactions, they're left only with themselves, and that demands maturity. It could be the moment they realize that clinging to someone is not love, it's control. That a real relationship is not built on dependency, but freedom, and to truly love someone, you must first let them choose to stay or walk away. And maybe, for the first time, they're forced to confront the shadow within themselves, the jealousy, the insecurity, the desperate expectations they once projected onto others under the name of love. None of this is pleasant, but all of it is an invitation to grow. Sometimes people need to break, not to fall apart, but to stop running, to stop avoiding, to finally look back on the path they've walked, not with blame, but with deeper understanding. And whether you return or not, what you left behind is not just a wound, it's a doorway toward themselves, toward a version no longer built on needing someone else to feel whole, a version capable of healing, of taking ownership, of loving without needing to possess. Not everyone will walk through that doorway. Many will choose to rebuild their illusions, find new distractions, loop the same patterns. But some, just a few, will start the real journey. And for them, you, through the quiet power of your exit, became the catalyst for a turning point they could never undo. So if you've ever doubted whether your withdrawal was too harsh, remember this: sometimes the wound is exactly what they needed to begin their becoming. It's not just them who changed, you're transforming too. When you walk away, everyone looks at the one left behind. How are they feeling? What did they lose? Do they regret anything? But there's one truth few notice, even you might have overlooked it. You're changing too. Withdrawal is not an easy act. It's an inner upheaval, a rejection of roles you may have carried for years, a cutting of invisible threads that once bound you to another's needs, emotions, and expectations. And it doesn't happen without leaving a mark. You didn't just leave them. You left behind a version of yourself that only existed within that relationship. Maybe you were the one who always soothed, always carried the weight, always listened until your own voice got lost. Maybe you were the peacemaker, the one who kept the peace while silencing your own storms. And when you let go, you weren't just letting go of them, you were letting go of the image of the one who's always strong, always patient, always there for someone else. Walking away didn't make you selfish. It made you honest. For the first time, you stepped back, not out of resentment, but out of the need to breathe. For the first time, you stopped carrying emotions that weren't yours to bear. You let yourself feel tired, feel fragile, feel the limits you used to deny. And strangely, it's in that silence, that distance, that you found a door leading inward toward a self you hadn't seen in a long time. You began to realize that what you once endured wasn't always love. It was fear. Fear of rejection, fear of being the bad one, fear that if you didn't hold it all together, no one would stay. But now, as you walk away, those fears rise, and instead of running, you face them. You learn to stand alone without feeling empty, to be quiet without feeling guilty, to love yourself without needing approval. Yes, it hurts. Transformation is never easy. There will be nights of doubt, moments when you question if you were too harsh. But as each emotional layer peels back, you'll touch something fragile and real: freedom. No one defines you anymore. No relationship forces you to play the savior. No conversation corners you into fake harmony. Just you, with all your once forgotten pieces, now coming into focus, authentic and lighter than ever. This isn't a new you, it's your true self, the one buried beneath years of roles and expectations. And that's why your withdrawal didn't just shake their world, it awakened your own. You begin to live at your own pace. No rushing, no proving, no permission needed. You realize you don't need to be understood to be valuable. You don't need to be kept to be significant. And from that realization, something new emerges: the ability to be still, to trust your inner compass, to witness everything without being swept up by anyone else's storm. That withdrawal, on the outside, looked like a sharp decision, but deep inside, it was a rite of passage. You stepped out of the role and returned to the author of your own story. And in that process, not only are you changing, you are rising, you are returning to life. Freedom doesn't come from being kept, but from the courage to let go. We often hold on to a relationship not because it still fits us, but because we lack the courage to let go. There is a persistent fear in all of us. Fear of losing, fear of being left behind, Fear that if we don't stay, we'll have no one, nothing left to cling to. But Carl Jung once said, "You cannot reach where you want to go if you're still holding on to where you once belonged." Letting go doesn't mean discarding. It is the deepest act of freedom, a freedom that no one can give. You must claim it for yourself by accepting what can no longer continue and setting down what has become too heavy to carry. You don't need to be kept in someone's life to prove your worth, and you don't need to stay just to maintain the illusion of closeness. Some relationships only persist because both parties are afraid of change. There is no longer true connection, only compromise. No longer real listening, only repetitive roles played day after day. And yet, to let go, you must pass through a deep contraction, a place where self-worth, affection, and old memories get stirred. You will ask yourself, am I giving up too soon? What if I tried a little harder? Would things be different? And it is precisely these questions that cause us to hesitate, prolonging days that no longer feel real. We confuse endurance with patience, self-sacrifice with self-abandonment, but perhaps you've gone far enough to see any relationship that constantly requires you to dim yourself is not a place worth staying. Letting go is not a cold act. It is an act of kindness to yourself and to the other person. Because when you let go, you offer both of you the chance to be honest, to ask who you are, where you're going, and whether you still truly want to go there together. Many see walking away as a failure, but sometimes it's the clearest sign of growth. The ones who aren't strong enough cling because they fear being alone. The ones who know themselves choose solitude if that is the price of truth. It's hard to step away from a familiar loop, especially when that loop once gave you a sense of worth. But ask yourself, did that worth come from real connection or from constantly proving you were enough to be loved? Freedom doesn't come from being kept in a role. It comes from the courage to walk away from a part you no longer wish to play. And sometimes, it's only in letting go that you realize no one can truly hold on to you unless you choose to stay. No one can define who you are unless you allow them to. Letting go is the final act of someone who knows themselves, someone who no longer needs others to confirm their worth, who no longer fears being misunderstood, and who no longer feels guilty for not carrying someone else's emotions. The one who dares to let go is the one who accepts ambiguity, accepts temporary emptiness to make space for something more meaningful to come in. In the silence after walking away, you may feel unsteady, but then you'll realize something miraculous. You're not missing anything. You're coming back to life, and the freedom you've been searching for it was never in being kept, but in knowing when to stop. You're not walking away. You're coming home. When someone walks away, it's a chance for both to begin again. More honestly, sometimes we leave, not to close a door, but to open one. Not because love has run out, but because we can't keep loving in the old way. When someone walks away, it sounds like an ending, but in truth, it might be the beginning of something more honest, more real, for both sides. Carl Jung once said, "You cannot awaken someone who is pretending to be asleep." And perhaps, when you chose to walk away from a relationship, it was the moment you stopped pretending. Pretending not to be tired, not to be hurt, not to be lost, pretending that everything was fine while inside, you were breaking a little more each day. Leaving, when done with deep awareness, is not just a personal act. It's an emotional tremor in the system two people once shared. It forces both to confront what was buried: dependency, expectation, disappointment, and the unspoken silence. For the one left behind, it's a moment of confronting themselves with no one left to reflect them, to blame, or to maintain a false sense of security. They're forced to ask, did I truly love this person, or just the role they played in my life? And if that person is no longer here, who am I? For the one who leaves, it's a journey through guilt, fear, and the haunting doubt of being the one who broke things. But eventually, they see the truth. No one breaks what was already broken. They simply become the one brave enough to clean up the fragments, to rebuild something more real. We live in a society that labels leaving as selfish, heartless betrayal. But look deeper, and that action may be a quiet invitation to awaken. Because sometimes, people only start growing when no one else is there to carry their emotions for them. Walking away exposes what was never said: the lack of communication, the invisible gap, the unmet expectations, the disrespected boundaries. And strangely, only from outside can both people finally see the relationship as it really was, not masked by routine or emotional bargaining. That is a precious opportunity. Not to return, but to reflect. Not to cling, but to learn how to connect differently. Without pressure, without performance, only with sincerity if both still wish to walk together, this time without the roles. And if they don't walk together again, that's still a gift because both have been given a chance to know themselves better. To see that love isn't about holding on at all costs, but having the courage to let go, if that's what allows each person to become who they truly are. The one who walks away doesn't just leave silence, they leave behind a message. Real love cannot exist without freedom. And freedom begins with saying no to what is no longer true. The one who stays, after anger, blame, or regret, also begins their own journey. Maybe it starts in bitterness, but eventually they'll see what your presence once obscured, the ability to stand on their own, the power to heal themselves. One person walks away and two people begin again, not necessarily together, but certainly with themselves, each returning to their own path this time, without pretending. Leaving is no longer the end. It is a reordering so that if they meet again in memory or in life, it is a meeting between two people who are truer, freer, and kinder to themselves.